you're thinking about 2 to 5 years ahead of the game. You're taking of what you know today. Who do I know that's going to be retiring, leaving, departing the organization, and starting today on who could that potential successor or successors take that person's place.
Welcome to the Value Factory Podcast, brought to you by OneAccord. We're all about helping businesses thrive and grow through leadership, strategy, and meaningful impact. Now, whether you're a seasoned executive or just starting out, our goal is to provide insights and inspiration to help you navigate your journey. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you for joining us, everyone. Welcome to the Value Factory, presented by OneAccord. We've got an exciting topic, one that has to be on the front burner of every business leader and owner. And, we're going to talk about succession planning. And just, our guest talks about the tsunami that's coming, and where succession planning used to be a nice to have, it's really evolved to a must have. And so I'm going to start off by introducing our guest. That's Mike Kadel. He is a managing principal for OneAccord and someone that I have gotten to know quite a bit. And he's got extensive expertise in financial services industry, spanning from retail, business, digital banking to private, also commercial and wealth management, as well as corporate marketing and communications. He is committed to drive change. He has a passion for nurturing talent and just unwavering about dedication to leader engagement, to have a consistent, delivered, high growth performance culture under his guidance. So I'm really excited to welcome Mike to our podcast today. I'm going to start off with the trivia question to you.
Sure.
So this is based on recent studies, and I have it on good authority here. The question is, how many baby boomers are expected to retire in I'm way off, in 2030? So just 5 years from now.
Can we respond to that?
Yeah.
So here's the interesting thing. I'll start with the banking and credit union sector. These are very alarming facts, is that in the community banking sector, and we're talking community banks anywhere from the 10 million asset under management all the way to the $1 trillion assets, that those banks in the country between now and 2030, 5 years from now, there's expected to be 10,000 retirements in the C-suite alone. So we're talking CEO and C-suite. That does not count the VPs or all the other important critical roles in a bank or credit union. So if you include the credit union side, there's another 10,000 that are expected to retire within now and 5 years. So if you look at the community financial institution sector as an aggregate, as a whole, Andrew, we have 20 C-suite individuals that are going to retire in the United States here within 5 years. So to your point, the tsunami is already here. It has hit. So if the bank or credit unions have not engaged or even thought about a succession plan, not just their C-suite, but their entire organization, now is the time to start.
Well, and so I'm hearing those big numbers. Is the talent available? Is the talent available to meet this incredible demand over the next 5 years?
Well, the talent is available if you start. And the talent from a succession planning perspective really should be looked internally. So as you look from an internal perspective, to be an invigorative culture, customer-centric organization is really what you want to look internally. And being able to identify those high potentials internally that could potentially take over the role, not tomorrow, but having a time horizon set. So when you know the expected departure of the individual that's leaving the organization, what does that timeline look like? So you can reverse engineer on putting a development plan in place. So when the timing is there, you're already prepared for that.
That makes really good sense. And I think you've answered the question to some extent already. But, my first question that I wanted to ask you, Mike, is why is succession planning so critical, specifically for financial institutions and specifically right now?
Well, specifically right now is those alarming facts we just talked about. The other critical piece to I want to also throw another statistic out there. Bank director is an organization that focuses on succession planning for bank direct board of directors. They put out a study every year that's called the Compensation and Talent Survey. They survey all the banks across the country. So what they've uncovered, those banks that are $100 billion in assets and below, this is staggering. 18% of those banks actually have a CEO successor named already or developing that CEO. So what that means, 82% of
Don't.
those banks, right? Simple math, 82% do not have a CEO successor. And that's just the CEO, let alone the C-suite and the other roles in the organization. So that's, to me, that's I couldn't speak any louder in terms of the sense of urgency that this industry needs to take a part of in engaging in a succession planning journey.
Well, and you, with your expertise in succession planning, and specifically for the financial sector, Mike, you're going to be a very busy person for the next several years.
I sure will. Team and I will be very happy to take on this assignment.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. It really blows my mind that over 80% of these 100 billion AUM assets under management banks, that the vast majority of them, they're not talking about it. They're not prepared. And, well, the axiom, prepare before you need it. So when you need it, you're prepared.
Absolutely.
So I've heard that having a replacement plan isn't enough anymore. And my question to you, Mike, is what is the distinction between succession planning and a replacement plan?
I love this question. So replacement planning is what a lot of banks think succession planning is. And unfortunately, that's not the case. Replacement planning is being very reactive. You're in crisis mode, right? It kicks in after someone announces their retirement, and what I like to call, it creates a lot of organizational drag that could be prevented by just having a succession plan, a robust succession plan in place. So succession planning is just the opposite. You're thinking about 2 to 5 years ahead of the game. You're taking of what you know today, who do I know that's going to be retiring, leaving, departing the organization, and starting today on who could that potential successor or successors take that person's place. And it's a step, but the next step in that is looking at your strategic plan. If you look at a bank strategic plan over the next 3 to 5 years, what roles do I need to have in place in 3 to 5 years that I don't have today? And who can I potentially groom for those future roles as they come available and as the need and demand requires those as I initiate and execute on those strategic initiatives. It's like planting trees now so you're not scrambling for shade later to use that analogy. It really helps create stability. It removes all the drama and all the gossip that comes out of a departure, and it replaces that with stability and sustainability, even through changes and transition.
I would think that any institution that's doing succession planning, that the team is going to feel better about their employer, that they are. Because what I'm hearing from you, Mike, is the key difference between succession planning and replacement planning is replacement is reactive, succession planning is proactive, and getting out in front of it. And is within the succession planning umbrella, does that also include the leadership development plan of the individuals that they are looking to groom up the ladder?
Yes, 100%.
Talk
100%.
a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I'm gonna give you a personal story, if I may. I'm gonna take you on a
Excellent.
personal
Yeah.
story myself that's very applicable. So, when I started in my banking career, I graduated um, many years ago. There were actually recruiters from all the major banks: Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chase. They all were at my campus at Kansas State University, which is in the middle of the Midwest. And they were actively recruiting graduates. And today you don't see that. So our industry needs to be rethinking their strategy and how to recruit incoming graduates from these major universities. And quite frankly, that's how I became a part of Wells Fargo Bank back in the early 90s because of that experience. To your question, those large banks invested in their people. Before I even saw, or even they put me in front of a customer, they put me in a very extensive 6-month training program that focused on commercial credit training that I took exams every 2 weeks. And it was very, very clear that if you did not pass the exam, you would be immediately terminated, which motivated people to study for these exams. But my point is, they gave you the tools to be successful. They arsoned you with the information and the real life experiences and making sure you were successful before they put you out in the field in front of a customer. Today, you're not seeing that, unfortunately. But what I will tell you, in my experience with these community banks, they're getting the hint that we need to reinstate these learning programs, these leadership programs. It's called growing your own strategy. It's developing, investing in your people so that you're putting together the successful tools and enabling them to be even more brighter and even more diligent in their career trajectory. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. Why do you think that it was so prominent when you were graduating? What kind of points to the fact that a lot of financial institutions stopped doing that type of
Yeah.
recruiting and training?
Well, a lot of it they would go after the experienced lenders or the experienced people in the field. They would just, steal one person from another bank and it would become one vicious cycle. And they realized that's really doesn't work. There's just so many people that you can poach from other institutions rather than taking the time and the investing in your own people, which to your point builds a much stronger and vibrant culture internally. So they're finally getting it. And those banks that are taking the initiative, putting their investment dollars in their people and growing and developing our talent are going to be the winners.
Yeah, and I think that if you have a corporate culture where you're bringing people from within the organization and providing the type of training that they need to keep climbing that career ladder, my guess is they would be a much more attractive institution to join than, say, one that wasn't proactive and not looking at their people's talent. Excellent. So, editor, I'm going to take just 1 second here. I've got to close the door. We're getting a little bit of outside noise. And so I'm just going to pick up right there or pick up on the next question. So, Mike, we've talked about different elements of succession planning and why it's more important than replacement planning, right? Nobody likes to be in, when you're in crisis, your options are much narrower. So that's not a good thing. But how deep should succession planning go in the organization? We've talked about the C-suite, but how far down the career ladder does your succession plan need to go? Or is it different based on the client?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely different based upon the client and where they are in their strategic planning and succession planning journey. But this is how I would answer this: is that it needs to go way beyond the C-suite, and I would even argue down even sometimes to the individual contributor level. And a good way to identify and understand where your critical roles lie in the organization is to ask yourself this question. So if you look at a role, if someone is in a role and they took a 2-month leave, and by saying a 2-month leave, you cannot have any contact with this person. It's like they disappeared from the face of the earth. You could not reach them. They can't be reached by email, phone call, etc. So once they took that 2-month leave, from a scale from 1 being the least concerned to 10 being the most concerned, how nervous would you be for that person to be gone 2 months? And if that rating is 5 or higher, then that role rather, needs a robust succession plan. And in banks and credit unions, those roles are typically in operations. And as you know, banking is a very highly regulated industry. So anyone in compliance, anyone that is attached to the regulatory environment, I would consider a critical role. So as you build bench strength and as you build organizational resilience, you need to be asking yourselves in the organization, where in the organization are these critical roles and how do we provide a development plan or succession planning for these roles. And it's not just about titles, Andrew. It's about functions, roles, and the scope of the role, and taking the titles out of it.
Well, what a great little device that our audience can use in terms of your 0 to 10 scale. Anything 5 or higher, those positions need to be part of the succession plan.
Yes, 100%.
And you had said that you really want to be doing that 2, 3, maybe even 5 years in advance. My guess is that the more critical the role, and the more mission critical the role, probably the longer the development cycle. Is that assumption accurate?
Yes, yes. And it's okay that and a lot of organizations try to tend away. If it's just say a person, you've identified a person to be ready within 3 years, organizations think, well, a lot can change in 3 years. Well, yeah, they're right, but you need to start at some point. And starting today, 3 years goes like that. And so by starting in a development plan and a leadership development program for that individual, you'll be amazed at how not only will that individual be ready, but how engaged and empowered that individual will be during the 3-year journey.
Yeah, I would think that that would also be a great retention strategy, because certainly as you're grooming people up the career ladder, you're going to be looking at if you're high performers, that people that not only have, the right soft skills, because a lot of these folks are going to be elevated into management, and they're going to have teams that they need to coordinate and organize. And in my experience, I think there's a lot more bad managers than good managers. Horrible grammar, but you get what I'm saying. I just, it's just absolutely nuts. I've also noticed, and I'd love your reaction to this, that especially in the sales role, that so often management or leadership will promote maybe the best salesperson, but maybe that person doesn't have the chops to be a good manager.
Yes,
Managing people is a lot easier said than done.
it sure is. And that's a really good example. Great salespeople don't always make the great leaders, and that's okay. And leaders require a whole different skill set.
Yeah.
I give a speech. We can talk about maybe this later. As I give a deliverable about what the future leaders of tomorrow, what those core competencies and skills need a future leader versus a leader of today. And as we transition and as companies evolve, the core competencies and skills of a leader change over time. And Nick Anderson will tell you that what got us OneAccord today requires a different skill set to bring OneAccord to where OneAccord needs to be tomorrow.
Right.
And it's all in transition. It's in how you empower leaders and give them the necessary tools for them to be successful. And I have to tell you, to that point, the soft skills are ever so more important than the hard skills. The skills around strategy, the skills around emotional intelligence, the skills around team building that you don't necessarily get. You can't read a book. Those are taught through on the job or through extensive experience in diving in and being an empowered and servant leader.
Yeah, and I think all of that communications, and I think personality has a lot to do with the individuals that are going to get promoted, especially from management into leadership. But I'd love to do a little deeper dive. You teased us by sharing that the competencies that are critical today in today's leadership, how that's going to change. Let's take a look at the same time horizon over 5 years with the stat of so many people retiring by 2030.
Yeah. So let's take a look at that. And so that's what I love about succession planning. So when you have an expected departure, now the leader has an opportunity to scale up. And what do I mean by that? Has an opportunity to add or even edit the core competencies required for that role, that new person filling that role, to be even more successful based on where the organization needs to go. And I'll give you an example of that. One organization I'm working with is in the midst of replacing their chief information officer. So we all know how important technology is, particularly to customers banking with financial institutions. So, in helping this CEO develop the job description, I gave him feedback is that now is the time to incorporate some skills for whatever reason maybe this prior person didn't have, whether it's AI, whether it's digital transformation, whether it's technology surrounding fraud prevention, all those things that banks deal with on a daily basis. Now it's time to upskill and look for those individuals, whether it's hopefully it's internally. And if it's not internally, what skills, what resources do we need to equip these people internally to eventually take over the role as a CIO? So that kind of gives you kind of a flavor of what we look at.
Great, great. And we've talked about this a little bit. You talked about how when you graduated, you were actively recruited. And, now it's kind of like a revolving door. Brand A poaches from brand B poaches from brand C, and so on. And so kind of going back to that,
Yes.
do you think that financial institutions today, that the industry is doing enough to attract young talent?
So I'm part of this too, but I want to be part of the solution. I would say no. I think our industry needs to do a much better job in being proactive and not only working with universities and secondary education organizations. But here's the other thing, Andrew, is banking isn't as sexy as going to working for a fintech company or big tech, working for Facebook or Meta or those other companies that we all think of that are quite frankly drawing those younger individuals into. And so banks need to do a better job of selling themselves on what it means to work for a bank and that there actually is a career path if you decide to take that route and be more diligent and deliberate about articulating what that career path looks like for an incoming or recently graduating individual coming in looking at the banking industry. So I think we could do a much better job of articulating our value proposition on what that looks like.
Well, and Mike, you talk about career pathing. And, my sense is that the financial institutions that are thinking proactively and succession planning, to me, I'm guessing what I've learned from you, it's not a set it and forget it. It's a very dynamic environment, right? As you said, things can change.
Yes.
But I would think that being proactive and being able to articulate the benefits of the career pathing and training that's going to go along is going to put those banks that are proactive. I think that they're going to have a competitive advantage in attracting talent.
Yes, for sure. Here's the other staggering statistic that if you look at, if a recruiter friend of mine told me this statistic, this comes from Harvard Business Review. So if a bank is looking to fill a critical role, let's just say it's in the C-suite. So if that hire is coming from internally versus that hire coming externally through a recruiter, that if it's coming through externally through a recruiter, there's a 30% more chance that that person's going to leave that role within the first year.
Wow.
So if you think about that for a second, why would you not focus on succession planning to avoid that statistic and be a part of that statistic for those banks or credit unions that are recruiting from outside their organization?
Yeah, and there's also a greater cost and
Yes.
probably time to recruit outside the organization. That's really ironic that you bring that up, Mike. The podcast that we just had a few days ago was about talent acquisition and recruiting. And of course, one of your peers as a managing principal at OneAccord is Kim Frost.
Yes.
She was our guest. Ironic how these two podcasts are, cross-pollinating, if you will.
Sure.
So wanting to know, how are the board of directors being involved in this process? How can they be involved without overstepping? And I'd like to know, as kind of a secondary, if that looks different for credit unions than it does for traditional banks.
Yeah. Love this question. So board of directors, we all know, have a fiduciary responsibility. So they need to stay out of the weeds. They need to let and empower their leadership team to run the organization. Um, from a succession planning perspective, they don't need to run the process, but they do need to normalize it. And by that, I mean they need to make succession a regular topic. And in fact, the board of directors that I'm working with, they're making succession planning and do a standing board agenda item. So every time they have a board meeting, whether it's every month, every quarter, there's a piece of the agenda where they need and deliberate in talking about where we are with the succession planning in the overall organization. So they want to see dashboards. They want to see at a very high level, again, they're on the board, of where in the organization where there may be some gaps or opportunities to improve specific areas as it relates to a successor in those critical roles. And the other piece to that is they're looking for the leadership teams to give them guidance on their succession. What banks and credit unions alike are very guilty of this, where there's not term limits set for boards of directors. So they're looking for their CEO and their C-suite to help them with their own succession planning engagements and journeys as it relates to their term limits, as well as helping them find other talented and influential individuals that can help them on their journey from an organization perspective. The other thing I want to speak to this is I'm seeing banks do a lot of stress testing. They're stress testing their credit portfolios. They're stress testing their interest rate risk of how if interest, we're in a very volatile interest rate environment today, but there's a lot of stress testing that goes on behind the seats from an asset liability perspective. What I'm seeing is they're taking that a step further by applying that stress testing philosophy to their succession planning. And what I mean by that, they're playing out different scenarios. Let's just say, for example, if their CEO won the lottery and they decided and they're turning their resignation tomorrow, how would they react to that? So who would they put in as an interim, or better yet, who have they groomed to this point that could take over that CEO role in the event that happened? So they're running these different scenarios, again, stress testing their succession plan to see if it plays out in real time.
So with the board role, and I would assume that if you're very proactive in keeping the board informed and up to date, that they're going to be less likely to try to get into the operational weeds because they're getting ongoing reporting on something that's obviously mission critical.
Totally. Absolutely. And they're asking the tough questions, which they should be, because the boards, they want a fiduciary responsibility. They should be asking the tough questions. So let's just say if there's an expected retirement in 2 years, they want to know, what is the leadership team doing in getting 2 or 3 individuals prepared for that role in the event that occurrence happens sooner than later. So they're being very proactive in their.
Is there any difference between a bank and a nonprofit in terms of how the board interacts with leadership? I mean, with banks, you've got your owners or stakeholders, and with credit unions, the owners are the members.
Yeah, very good point. So yeah, there's a different philosophy for sure in terms of how boards of a credit union think versus, or even respond, versus how a community bank board member. So community banks obviously are more profit oriented. They're more shareholder driven, where credit unions are more member driven and less focused on profit and returns to share. Because in credit unions, you have no shareholders. So you have to look at it from that lens. So if you're a board of director from a credit union, you're typically a volunteer. It's typically a non-paid position. So you're there because of the mission of the organization. It's very mission driven and very purposeful in terms of carrying out the mission as it relates to the organization. Board of directors for community banks, they're typically paid through stock and cash, combination thereof, based upon the talent and the contribution and the value that they bring to the organization. So the philosophy and the motivation, so to speak, is a little bit different and varied based upon how a credit union looks from a board and how a bank does.
Yeah, that makes great sense. And from my experience, when you're looking at a small community bank, the chair of that board is often the founder / CEO.
Yes.
And that actually, I think, I've seen it. I've seen pros and cons to that dynamic.
100%.
Yeah.
Particularly we work with both public and non-public banks. And so there's a whole different philosophy around a family-owned or privately owned institution than a public. They just think differently. They both want to grow. Growth is not an option, but how they grow is much different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get a little bit more detailed in the succession planning, and how do you go about identifying the top talent in an organization to begin the process? If you can get a little bit more tactical in that area, maybe examples on things that you would do to expose the top talent,
Sure.
especially with larger organizations, they might not be on the radar.
Absolutely. So what we typically find is on a typical engagement, we start with the strategic plan. And strategic plan and succession plans, there's a function of one or the other. They need to be very linked together. So we start by asking the simple questions. Who do you know today that will be retiring or expected to retire within the next 1 to 3 years? Let's get that list together. The second is based upon the strategic plan, what roles do you need to be filling within 1 to 3 years in order to execute on those strategic initiatives, whether it's going into a new geography, whether it's hiring a chief revenue officer, whether it's hiring a chief operations officer, being able to scale and grow and internally equip the organization to grow from an internal perspective. Whatever that role is, let's define it and let's identify what that role is. So once you have all those roles whether it's a spreadsheet or Google Sheet or a dashboard, take the next step. Who in the organization today, again, not just one, but the goal is to look for at least 3 potential successors of those roles you've identified. In who could you groom to potentially develop into those roles based upon what you know today, what their ability and their skill sets to grow and their willingness to grow. We all know it's not only the ability, but the person's willingness to step up, because if the organization is going to invest in an individual, we want to know the individual is going to meet the organization halfway in investing the time and the resources and taking time away from their family in order to make this work. And it's okay if they say no, but we need to know that today.
So we're not scrambling in 2-3 years.
Totally.
And I would also assume, I mean, I'm really big on performance management and accountability. And my guess is that if you've got 2 or 3 years to groom somebody, you say you're doing your 3-person rule, you can really pay attention to their performance, and probably after a couple years have a little bit more information to act on choosing one of the 3 with greater confidence.
And I'll give you another personal example I have, if I may.
Excellent.
When I was chief operating officer for a credit union in the Bay Area, I thought I had identified a very good successor to be head of the VP of operations. They were in it. They were excited about it. We had a development plan that we co-created together. And within 6 months into the program, life happens. This person unfortunately had a change in family dynamics. And this person came to me and said, I thought I was there 6 months ago, but things have changed according to my family. So I'm going to have to take a step back. And I'm so glad they had the courage and the impetus to have that conversation, because it allowed me to course correct. And I celebrated and recognized and thanked this individual for having that conversation. So
That's fantastic. And you also are explaining why you need to have more than one target to fill that role. I like your 3 rule. I also think that competition is very healthy and it brings out the best in everybody. And the organization benefits, especially when they are on a growth trajectory.
100%. Whole organization benefits.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, Mike. I have the benefit of knowing you well, frankly, and learning from you. We're both financial kind of geeks, you far more than I. But I wondered, before we close out, is there any other information related to succession planning or leadership that you want to share with our business leader and entrepreneur audience?
Yeah, very good. I'd love to share a couple thoughts. One, I sometimes get this question, when do you start a succession? And my response is you can never start too early. The sooner you
Yesterday.
start, yesterday. The sooner you start, the better it is for you, the organization, and the person that you're grooming for the role. Again, the second question I get is how does human resources become a part of this? So human resources, a lot of leaders I talk to, they think, well, this is human resources job. Wrong answer. Yes, human resources is a very important partner and a strategic partner to help you through it. But if you're the leader, it is your utmost responsibility to find a successor, not only for your replacement, but for others in your direct domain that you have responsibility for. So it's incumbent upon us as leaders to take the initiative and and double down on succession planning and to your earlier point, it's not a nice to have. This is a must have.
Right.
From a financial institution perspective, regulators are asking the tough questions, not just the board, but the regulators are asking, where is your succession planning for this individual or this role? They're asking for concrete evidence. So it's becoming very imperative that financial institutions in particular take this very seriously.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing from you, Mike, is that this is not a responsibility to delegate. It really needs to come from the top down and the C-suite. And I also loved how you talked about how important the linkage is or interdependencies between the strategic plan, which is also a long-range view, and succession planning. I don't know how you could unpack those.
Yeah, it's really important because, as we develop strategic plans for financial institutions, whether it's talent development, whether it's finding critical roles, whether it's empowering employees, a talent development strategy always comes to the surface of a strategic initiative in 99% of my engagement so far. So thanks, sir.
Well, I'm sorry. Go
No,
ahead.
no. Thanks for taking it very seriously, which is a good sign.
Yes, that's fantastic. Well, Mike Kadel, I so appreciate your time and your talent. And as we're thanking our guest, I'll also say to our audience, thank you for joining the Value Factory podcast presented by OneAccord. We'll hope to see you next time. And thank you again, Mr. Kadel.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure.
Have a great day.
Take care.